Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today let's talk about He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. So, I've just finished rereading He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope, and I thought it would be nice to do an individual review slash a ramble about it. Probably more of a ramble than a review because I haven't written any notes and I have no plan. But I love this book so much and I love it so much, and I thought it would be nice to talk about. And I know that while individual book reviews are not the most popular on BookTube, I know I do have several people who watch my videos who love Anthony Trollope as I do, so I thought it would be fun to talk about this one. This is going to be a spoiler-free video. I'm going to talk about the premise and the characters and things like that, but I'm not going to talk about what happens kind of later on in the plot. If you don't know, I have been working my way through the novels of Anthony Trollope. He is a fantastic Victorian writer, one of my absolute favourites, and he wrote 47 books. I have been working my way through them and I'm getting near to the end. I've got 7 Anthony Trollope books left to read for the first time. And there's also one other that I want to reread, and I also want to read his biography, his autobiography, and I'm going to try and do that in the rest of 2025. But one thing I also knew that I wanted to do this year was reread He Knew He Was Right, because I knew that I hadn't read that since I was a teenager. So my first kind of introduction to Anthony Trollope as an author was through 2 novels, He Knew He Was Right and The Way We Live Now. And in fact, I think before I read those 2 novels, I saw the adaptations, the television adaptations of those 2 books from the early 2000s. I saw both those adaptations and then read both of those books. Annoyingly, I can't remember which one I read first. I'm not sure which one I read first. I feel like I watched the adaptation of He Knew He Was Right first. So did I then read He Knew He Was Right before I read The Way We Live Now? I can't quite remember. I was probably about 14 or 15. So it was, you know, a good slightly more than half my lifetime ago. But it's quite annoying that I can't remember, because I feel like I want to remember what my first Anthony Trollope was. You know, I remember the first Bronte book, the first Dickens, Gaskell, Austen book that I read, but I don't remember the first Trollope book I read. I don't know which one it was. But anyway, I read The Way We Live Now and He Knew He Was Right as a teenager, loved them both. And then I reread The Way We Live Now not long after, because I wrote an A-level essay on it. So I read The Way We Live Now for the first time when I was like 15, then reread it when I was 18, and have reread it several times since. I can't remember now how many times I've read The Way We Live Now, but I think probably 4 times-ish. But this was only the second time that I have read He Knew He Was Right. And I always knew that I wanted to return to it because I had loved it a lot as a teenager, and also because it is, I think, one of Anthony Trollope's best books, and it does a lot of the things that I like in Anthony Trollope, and a lot of the things he does well. This is not a very elegant review, is it? Because I haven't even told you what the book is about. So let's start off with that, and then I will talk about some of the reasons why I love it and why I love Anthony Trollope, and just have a ramble. Basically, this is mostly just to stop me from rambling on about He Knew He Was Right for like 10 minutes in my wrap up for the month of March. So anyway, so He Knew He Was Right, as you can see, it's quite a long book, quite a lengthy one. So it has quite a lot of different plots and subplots kind of weaving together in that way that I absolutely love in Anthony Trollope and various other Victorian writers. But the kind of central plot, I suppose, revolves around a fairly newly married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Trevelyan, Emily and Louis Trevelyan. They get married at the beginning of the book, and they are together for, I suppose, probably about 2 years, and they have a young son, and after they've been together for about 2 years, things in their marriage start to go awry, because Louis is jealous of and suspicious of Emily's friend with an older man called Colonel Osborne, who is quite a lot older than both of them, a friend of her father's, in his 50s, but like quite charming, and thinks of himself as being slightly younger than he is. Louis is not really comfortable with Emily's friendship with him, and Louis tells Emily to spend less time with him, and Emily is furious that Louis is jealous and has any suspicions of her, and we kind of watch the breakdown of their marriage from this point onwards, looking at how Louis' suspicions and jealousies drive such a wedge between them. But we also follow lots of other different characters. So we're also following Emily's sister, Nora. We're also following Louis' sort of old friend, Hugh Stanbury, who's a newspaper journalist. And then we're also following some other members of Hugh's family, including Hugh's sister Dorothy and Hugh's aunt, Miss Stanbury, who Dorothy is kind of sent away to live with early on in the novel. And then we also end up following a man called Mr. Glasscock, who is sort of a friend of the Trevelyan's, and who's kind of in love with Nora. Louis and Emily live in London, but Dorothy Stanbury and her aunt Miss Stanbury live in Exeter, and we also end up following some other characters in Exeter. And so quite a lot of the book kind of takes place between London and Exeter, with also some bits in Italy. And we have various kind of characters that are connected to the Trevelyan's in some way. And I just think it's fantastic. I think it is really, really, really good. I think it's one of Trollope's best. I will, when I finish reading all his 47 novels, make a ranking. But I do feel like He Knew He Was Right will be quite high up in that ranking. It won't be at the top. It wouldn't beat The Way We Live Now or The Small House at Allington for me. But it would be maybe in the top 5. And I do think it is really worth a read. It's a standalone novel, which, you know, not all of his are. The Small House at Allington, for example, is the 5th book in a series, so not necessarily like a great one to start with. I would recommend reading the rest of the Barchester Chronicles first, but I think He Knew He Was Right and The Way We Live Now, like, I understand why they are two of Anthony Trollope's most famous books. I understand why they are the two that got made into a miniseries in the 2000s, and I do think they're both fantastic. And He Knew He Was Right is a really, really interesting novel. There's so much I love about He Knew He Was Right. I feel like it does all the things I love in an Anthony Trollope novel, while also doing some quite different and interesting things. So when I say all the things I love in an Anthony Trollope novel, I love an Anthony Trollope book with lots of different characters and lots of different subplots, and seeing how all those things weave together. I love an Anthony Trollope book that looks at London life, but I also love an Anthony Trollope book that looks at small town life. And while Exeter is a city, not a town, and, you know, was a city at this point in time, I do feel like that kind of like smaller provincial city life is captured really, really well in the way that he looks at various characters living in Exeter. I also absolutely love Anthony Trollope's characterization, and I think in He Knew He Was Right, the characterization is really good, really believable and realistic and complex, and so well done. What I love in an Anthony Trollope novel is in part his love stories, and I think there are some excellent love stories in here, and I especially enjoy like Dorothy's subplot and Nora's subplot, and like how those love stories work are really, really fun. One thing you will often find in Anthony Trollope books, which I really love, is a couple who meet, fall in love, and they both love each other. That's not the problem, but the problem is financial circumstances and family opposition and all the other difficulties that might stop people getting married in the Victorian period. And there's a really interesting look at, you know, several different characters in complicated circumstances with regards to their future lives and marriage possibilities in He Knew He Was Right, and that works really well. But I also think that central plot with Louis and Emily and the collapse of their marriage is really well done and really, really interesting, and quite a rare plot to find in a Victorian book. Like, you do sometimes read about the separation and breakdown of marriages in Victorian literature, but like not that often, and not with the depth and complexity that you see within He Knew He Was Right. And I think the way the book looks at like the technicalities of a separation between a married couple within the Victorian period, the technicalities around custody of a child in the Victorian period, like that stuff is all fascinating and really, really interesting. And because of that plot line and how sort of dark it gets in places, and how tragic bits of it are, like I think this book has such a great balance of like the light and the shade, because you have that like Anthony Trollope sheer joy in some of the other love stories going on in here, but you also have this central like breakdown of a marriage where you are kind of watching a disaster happening. Like, I think that is done so well too, and the kind of combination of like all the social criticism with the like psychological realism within it, I just think is fantastic. One of the kind of main themes of this book is stubbornness. And we see this through lots of different characters. And one thing I was kind of thinking about a lot as I reread this was how Anthony Trollope looks at like how a little stubbornness is good, but too much can be disastrous. Because the breakdown of this marriage partly comes because Louis is so stubborn. You know, the title of his book is He Knew He Was Right, but like he's not right. And you know all the way through the book that he isn't right, but he can't. The idea that he might not be right is just impossible to him. Louis' stubbornness and Louis' inability to admit that there is any possibility he could be wrong about anything is a lot of his downfall, I suppose, and is a lot of the tragedy of this book. And Emily is stubborn in her way, though, like, I think Emily's stubbornness is much more forgivable than Louis'. And I think it's really interesting to see how stubbornness is kind of treated in that plot, because in many of the other subplots in the book, we see stubbornness be really positive. So there are elements of the book where Nora, Emily's sister, is stubborn, and you're like, yes, go Nora. I don't want to give you spoilers, but I love the places that Nora is stubborn, and I think it's really cool. And there are places where Dorothy is stubborn, and you see the positiveness there. There are places where Hugh is stubborn. There are various places where we see characters be stubborn for good, but there are also places where we see it for evil. I mentioned a little bit the character of Miss Stanbury, who is Dorothy and Hugh's elderly aunt, who I love. We'll talk about her more in a second. But Miss Stanbury is also very stubborn, and we also are led to understand at various points in the book that she is too stubborn, and that sometimes it would be good for her to admit that maybe she's been wrong. And I feel like the way she ties into the theme of stubbornness is really, really interesting. There's also this character at Exeter, Mr. Gibson, who is a clergyman who has like various women who want to marry him, and he's quite indecisive about who to marry, and he could do with a bit more firmness and stubbornness in his attitude. And it's kind of quite interesting to see how like stubbornness as a theme is looked at throughout He Knew He Was Right, the kind of difference between stubbornness and firmness, and like the times when people should back down and the times when they shouldn't. Like, I feel like the way Anthony Trollope looks at that is really, really interesting. What else do I want to say about He Knew He Was Right? I think the characterization is incredible. There are so many characters in here that I love. My favourite character is probably Miss Stanbury, who I just absolutely adore. She's so funny, and she's so frustrating, but also like so enjoyable to read. I'm going to read you the letter that she sends to her relations to invite Dorothy to come and live with her, because I think it tells you kind of all you need to know about Miss Stanbury as a character. My dear sister Stanbury, your son Hugh has taken to courses of which I do not approve, and therefore I have put an end to my connection with him. I shall be happy to entertain your daughter Dorothy in my house if you and she approve of such a plan. Should you agree to this, she will be welcome to receive you or her sister, not her brother, in my house any Wednesday morning between 9:30 and 12:30. I will endeavour to make my house pleasant to her and useful, and will make her an allowance of £25 per annum for her clothes as long as she may remain with me. I shall expect her to be regular at meals, to be constant in going to church, and not to read modern novels. I intend the arrangement to be permanent, but of course I must retain the power of closing it if and when I shall see fit. Its permanence must be contingent on my life. I have no power for providing for anyone after my death. Yours truly, Jemima Stanbury. P.S. I hope the young lady does not have any false hair about her. Miss Stanbury is quite judgmental and very fixed and quite stern, and doesn't make much effort to understand other people, but beneath that she has a kind heart and a real wish for companionship and affection, and she has a lot of like love to give, and I just think she's such a well-created character. And I feel like within Victorian literature you get quite a lot of like old men who fit into this role. Like, I can think of quite a lot in Anthony Trollope, and also a few in Elizabeth Gaskell. She's Squire Hamley from Wives and Daughters, you know, the sort of like gruff elderly squire character who actually really means well but can't quite express his feelings. I feel like you get quite a lot of them in quite a few Anthony Trollope novels and in quite a few Victorian novels more broadly, but you don't see many of the equivalent elderly lady characters with those characteristics. And I really, really enjoy a good Victorian literary grumpy old man. And Miss Stanbury is a Victorian literary grumpy old woman, and I really, really enjoy her too. And I think she's just such a delight to read about, and I really enjoy her as a character. I suppose you do get some, actually. I feel like probably Catherine in Margaret Oliphant's Hester might have some things in common with Miss Stanbury. They would be quite interesting to compare. Anyway, I'll have to think about that another time. But yeah, I just really, really enjoy Miss Stanbury as a character. And I enjoy all her dialogue and all her scenes. And her relationship with Dorothy is just so, like, well created and well done. And it's a really, like, nice central relationship to have, this relationship between aunt and niece, and how they thought to each other over the course of the book. I also love Dorothy's arc. Dorothy is a great character, and I really enjoy her kind of like coming into her own and her gaining self-confidence, and how we see her change across the course of the novel. I like her a lot. I really like Hugh Stanbury as well. In fact, basically all the Stanburys. Priscilla is great as well. I love Priscilla. Priscilla's so cool. There's 3 siblings, Dorothy, Hugh, and Priscilla. And Priscilla has no interest in marriage, no interest in men at all. The only man she like has any interest in even speaking to is her brother Hugh. And I feel like her views on marriage, and her views on like the position of women are quite interesting. And I love Hugh Stanbury as well. I think he's quite an interesting character. He writes for a fairly left-wing penny newspaper. That's the proceeding that his aunt doesn't approve of. He's quite like bohemian in some ways. I think that word is used once or twice. I really enjoy Hugh as a character, and I think he's well done and really interesting. I also think Emily and Louis Trevelyan are really well drawn. I think especially Louis Trevelyan. I think Emily is well drawn, but I also feel like there are places where I wish we saw even more of Emily. I feel like there are so many characters in this book, and Anthony Trollope obviously loves writing about them all, and I feel like in the second half of the novel, maybe he is more interested in his subplots than the central plot as much, or maybe like a little bit less interested in Emily Trevelyan. And I feel like sometimes I wish we saw more into her head. I do think you get a really good sense of her, but every now and then I kind of wish there was even more. But Louis Trevelyan, I think, is a very interesting character. I kind of dislike him so much, but I also think he is fascinating, and there are also times where you do feel quite sorry for him. One thing that I do think is really, really interesting throughout He Knew He Was Right is kind of the way it looks at the position of women and the kind of like limited life options and life chances, possibilities for women, and also like the difficulties that women face within marriage. I definitely think that Anthony Trollope is like not as proto-feminist as I necessarily like want him to be. And I definitely think there are a lot of other Victorian writers who are much more proto-feminist than Anthony Trollope. You know, I think there are other Victorian writers who engage much more radically with gender, and especially kind of like of the next generation down from Anthony Trollope. But while I don't think Anthony Trollope is as proto-feminist as I want him to be always, and while he is quite like patronising / sneering about women's rights movements in a few of his books, and that does annoy me, I do think that he has a real like understanding of power structures around gender, and I think he has a real understanding of the position of women at this point in time and the difficulties that causes and the lack of options for women. There are quite a few conversations kind of about limited options for women, both for the kind of unmarried women like Nora and Dorothy, like looking forward to their future, what possibilities they have open to them or not open to them, and how much their lives will be defined by the men they marry, or if they don't marry, defined by that. And I think the way Trollope looks at that and kind of like the social context of that and the implications of that is really, really interesting. And I also think he looks really interestingly at like Emily's plight and how difficult like her marriage is, and how much she is constrained and trapped by that marriage, and also how unfair some of the like legal things are around that. And I also think like the whole argument in their marriage is in many ways about gender, because part of the issue is that Louis says to Emily, well, I don't want you to see Colonel Osborne, and I've told you not to, and you're my wife, so you should obey me. The fact that Louis wants to have power over Emily, that she, as a person, is not willing to give up, is part of the conflict between them. And that is obviously like so bound up in gender roles within Victorian marriage. And the fact that Louis just cannot admit the possibility that he might not be right is for Louis like bound up in like self-respect that is bound up in masculinity. And I think the way Anthony Trollope looks at that in this book is really, really interesting and really complex. So even though this novel does contain quite a rude portrait of an American woman who's really keen on women's rights, I do think, like, despite that, there is quite a lot in this book that is quite interesting in terms of challenging gender roles and like criticising gender power dynamics within the Victorian period, which I always find very interesting. Do I have anything else to say about He Knew He Was Right? I feel like I've just rambled on in a very nonsensical fashion. I do just think Anthony Trollope has some truly amazing books, and I just think he's wonderful. So there we go. That was a very rambly, not very structured review of He Knew He Was Right. But hopefully this was interesting and I may have persuaded you to read this excellent book. In fact, one thing I didn't say was I didn't actually read this book physically. I listened to the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Nigel Patterson, which I really enjoyed. So I read this physically when I first read it as a teenager, and I always really like rereading books on audiobook because I think it gives you a slightly different reading experience to you had the first time if you read them physically the first time, as I did with He Knew He Was Right. And I also really enjoy classics on audiobook because I think a lot of Victorian writers write in a way that quite suits being read aloud. So yeah, I really enjoyed that audiobook and I would definitely recommend it. And yeah, this was a fantastic book, really, really thematically interesting. One of Anthony Trollope's like most thematically interesting books, I suppose. And I feel like, you know, Anthony Trollope wrote 47 novels. Most people are not, like me, going to read all of them, but if you're not going to read all of them and you are going to read, say, like 5 to 10 of them, then I would recommend making He Knew He Was Right one of them, because I do think it's fantastic and I do think it's really, really interesting. And I think especially if you're interested in like gender within Victorian literature or marriage within Victorian literature, the breakdown of marriage within Victorian literature, then I do think you would find He Knew He Was Right really, really fascinating. And yes, I'm very glad that I reread it this year. So that is all for now. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read this book, if you've read much else by Trollope, what you like about his books, what you have read by him. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. I can't remember how many times I've read The Way We Live Now. That's not a good book title to use in a sentence with the word now.